everyone. My name is Olabode Immanuel Bini, and this intro presentation is for introduction to global ethics. And today I'll be examining questions that have become increasingly relevant in classrooms around the world. It is morally acceptable to submit an assignment written entirely by AI as your own work, or rather than approaching this from a rule book perspective. I will evaluate through the lens of one of the most important moral philosophers, Immanuel Kant, and specifically through his three formulation of categorical imperative. Here is the roadmap for our discussion. So we will examine whether submitting an AI generated assignment is morally acceptable, evaluated through Immanuel Kant's Deontological ethical theory. Unlike approaches that focus on consequences, Kant's framework focuses on duties and principles on the right. You can see the three formulations we apply. First, the universal law, followed by humanity as an end, and lastly, as kingdom of ends. We rationally eloquently endorse this rule. Each formulation gives us a different angle of the same questions. So let's continue. Before we get to Kant's specific principle, let me quickly define deontology. Deontology is an ethical theory focused on duties and moral obligations, unlike unitarianism, which judges actions by their consequences. Deontology asks whether the action itself is right according to universal principle. Kant argues that moral actions come from rational duties. We act morally when we act from principle, not from inclination or expected reward. The key question which you can see in the callout is this: is the action morally right according to a universal principle? That's a test we'll be applying throughout this presentation. This is the heart of Kant's moral philosophy, the categorical imperative. He writes, and I quote, "Act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become universal law." What does this mean in plain terms? A maxim is simply the principle behind the action. Kant is saying we should only follow rules that everyone would reasonably follow. Moral duties apply equally to all rational persons. There are no specific exceptions. If a principle cannot be universally without contradiction, then acting on it is morally regardless of the consequences. Let's continue. Now let me examine the scenario we are evaluating. A student uses an AI tool to generate an entire assignment and submits it as their own work, without disclosure, without attribution, and without any substantial intellectual contribution of their own. The act here is not the use of AI, but the concealment of it. This raises four ethical concerns. First, academic dishonesty, the work misrepresents authorship to the instructor. Second, misrepresentation of ability. Grades no longer reflect the student's actual knowledge. Third, unfair advantage. Peers who complete their own work are placed at a disadvantage. And fourth, violation of trust. The implicit contract between student and educator is broken. Now, we apply Kant's first formulation, universal law. The question is, could the student's action become a universal rule? Step 1. The test. Imagine everyone submitted AI generated work as their own without disclosure and every assignment. Step 2. The consequence. If everyone these days, grades will no longer represent student actual knowledge. Academic evaluation will lose its meaning entirely. Trust between students and the creator will collapse. Step 3. The verdict. A maxim that when universalized destroy the very institution it relies on cannot be waived as universal law. The action is therefore morally impermissible. The Kantian conclusion is clear. Submitting AI work without disclosure fails the universality test. Kant's second formulation states, treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always as an end and never merely as a means. Applying this to our scenario, we can identify three parties being used merely as means. First, the instructor. The student uses the instructor as a means to obtain a grade, withholding the information the instructor needs to access honestly. Second, other students. Peers are used as a comparative background, with the student gaining an unfair advantage without their consent. And third, The students themselves, by outsourcing the work, they fail to respect their own rational capacities for learning, judgment, and growth. The conclusion is that this action violates human dignity and autonomy on three fronts. The third formulation asks, what rules would rational people create for a fair society? The kingdom of hens. In Kant's thought experiment, imagine a community of rational beings who jointly legislate the moral laws they themselves will follow. A rule is just only if such a community could endorse it. A Kantian university will value three things: honesty, members represent their work truthfully; fair assessment, grades reflect genuine effort and understanding, not the certification of one's choice; and respect for achievement. Academic accomplishment is honored because it represents real rational work. The verdict: a rule permitting undisclosed AI generated assignment could not be legislated in a kingdom of hens because it would undermine the very community it pretends to serve. Yeah. Before concluding, let me address a possible counter argument. Some may defend AI use by pointing that AI improves efficiency, that is a useful learning tools, and that education should integrate new technologies rather than resist them. These are all fair points, but the Kantian response is crucial. Using AI is not the problem. Deception is. None of those three arguments require dishonesty. A Kantian can fully endorse AI as a tool, provided its use is disclosed and the student's own rational contribution remains central. Ethical uses include brainstorming ideas, improving writing, and learning concepts. The Kantian objection targets consumers and not technology. So, from the table given, this table summarizes the principle, the moral evaluation using AI as a learning assistant is acceptable. It supports the student's rational work. Disclosing AI assistant in submitted work is also acceptable. It preserves honesty and allows for informed assessment, but submitting AI work as your own is unethical. It violates all three formulations of the categorical imperative. The key insight is that the same tool used differently can be either permissible or impermissible. The decisive factor is whether the use represents the duty of honesty. The use is not technology itself, it is dishonesty. What broader implications does Kant's theory offer here? First, honesty is a duty. Truthfulness is not a strategy for better outcomes. It is non-negotiable obligation of every rational agent toward every other. Second, rules must apply universally. A moral principle must be followed by everyone, and if universalizing a maxim will undermine the practice it depends on, the maxim is permissible. Third, person deserve respect. Other people in the universe must be treated as end in themselves, never merely an instrument for grades, advantage, or convenience. The bottom line is that academic integrity ultimately depends on trust between student and educator, and trust, once universalized away, cannot be rebuilt by any one student. To conclude, deontology focuses on duty rather than consequences. Kant's categorical imperative provides a framework for ethical decision that does not depend on predictive outcomes, only on the rational test of principle behind the action. Applying that test to our case, submitting AI generated work as one own violates every formulation of categorical imperative. It fails universality because the maxim cannot be weighed for everyone without self-contradiction. It violates respect for humanity because instructors, peers, and the students themselves are treated merely as means, and it could not be legislated in the kingdom of hens. No rational community of moral legislation will endorse such a rule. The verdict is consistent across three formulations. The action is morally wrong. I like to close with a personal reflection. Kant's theory demonstrates that ethical decisions require more than asking whether an action benefits us. We must consider whether our actions respect others and whether they could become a moral rule for everyone. For me, the value of this exercise was less in reaching a verdict about a single student and more seeing how a 240-year ethical framework still speaks directly to the technologies reshaping education today. The question Kant focus us to ask, could anyone do this? Is exactly the question AI forces us to to ask. These are the sources I referenced and cited in the style given to us. Matthew and Hendrick's Introduction to Philosophy, Ethics from Rebels Community, and so on and so forth. These are the references.